So now we're taking a look at Morphy's first game against Paulson. So the battle between the two top contenders. And as we mentioned, this is not going to be a blowover where Morphy's just going to overwhelm his opponent. Although it's going to show from time to time, there's still going to be problems, but at least we know there's going to be a struggle ahead. Paulson isn't going to just fold and give them the 3-0. Well, actually, technically, in the finals, I should say, the final match, I believe it was 5 wins. First to 5 wins the match, draws not counting. And so the game we're about to look at, Morphy's going to win the first game. He ended up playing somewhat poorly in the second game, which I think resulted in a draw. And the rules at the time were that draws did not count. So then you had to replay the game if the result was a draw with the same colors. And I was reading somewhere, I think it's Zenon Franco's book on Morphy, where he said, we have to keep in mind these games are played without a clock. And I think game 2, he reported that the game lasted like 15 hours, and Paulson spent 12 hours on the game, and Morphy around 3. So definitely, I think that would be filed under cruel and unusual punishment regarding playing one of those games. But anyway, this was their first game, and Morphy's going to transpose into an open Sicilian. The modern approach is to play knight f3 to help support the d4 pawn break. But Morphy decides to play d4 immediately. And after c takes d4, knight f3, he attacks the pawn. And there's an amusing little trap here that you'll sometimes see where Black will try to punish this move order. That is to say, the early d4 before playing knight f3. And the way that Black could attempt to punish this is to play e5 with the idea of saying, okay, I'm holding on to this pawn. And it looks like the pawn is hanging, but unfortunately for white, there's the nice response, queen a5, forking the king and knight. Now, in this sort of position, we'd have to embrace our inner Morphy. Yes, we're going down a pawn, but you could play the move c3 as an example, which would turn this into a true pawn sacrifice, reminiscent of a Smith-Morra gambit in the Sicilian. And the idea is that you would gain rapid development, and because the pawn is on e5, it can never move back to e6. So this light squared bishop would be prepared to slice through the a2 to g8 diagonal and cause a lot of problems in Black's camp. But in any event, that's just a fun little opening detail to know. But after knight f3, Paulson played e6. And after knight takes d4, bishop c5 was played. And I believe it was game 5 that Morphy decided to improve on his play with the mantra of development, 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 and play bishop e3. Emphasize and maximize active development, rapidly develop his forces as quickly as possible. In this game, Morphy played the sensible but not as strong knight b3. The knight feels a little bit offside here, but it does remove some of the pressure, of course, the bishop was exerting, and it threatens the bishop. So Paulson steps back, and after knight c3, Black would love to play the move knight f6. The problem, though, is that Morphy would be able to play e5. And in this case, there really isn't a good move for the knight, because notice d5, the space that the e4 pawn left behind, is protected by both the knight and the queen. So there really isn't a good option here for the knight, and that's why Paulson played the move knight e7. And one thing to think about, the Sicilian is perfectly sound, one of the best openings for Black against e4. But when you play c5, and when you play this variation with e6, it's important to think about the space that these pawns have left behind. And notice that the c pawn no longer guards d6, where it did on its starting square. And the e pawn is also no longer guarding d6. So this means that d6 is a weak square. And this will be something that Morphy's going to target immediately with bishop f4. And then this is another example where Black needs to play energetically. That's the thing that made Morphy such a difficult opponent, other than just how talented he was and just his feel, for dynamic chess. But also, you had to match his energy. You had to fight fire with fire. And in this sort of situation, Paulson needs to play d5 and just embrace the complications, strike in the center, and see what happens. Now, here, Paulson didn't really sense any urgency and said, well, if I play d5, maybe my king would get exposed. So why don't I just sort of relax a move and castle? Well, that's an improvement over Thompson's play from the last game, castling the king to safety. But the problem is, Morphy wasn't just about breathing fire on the chessboard. In this case, he demonstrates really good positional awareness by taking advantage of Black's weakened dark squares with bishop d6. And I really urge everyone to pay attention to this sort of idea, because we're going to see Paul use something quite similar against Paulson in the next game, the grand finale. And it has a lot to do with pouncing on weakened squares. And he's going to combine positional restriction with active dynamic piece play in the final game we're going to look at. But this is an important instructive idea, that he plants his bishop on d6. He pins the knight to the rook. That's true, but that's not really his main point. The main point is that the light squared bishop is completely imprisoned on its starting square. That's why we said it was so important for Paulson to play d5, actively fight for the center, and help this light squared bishop out. And this is something that's going to haunt Paulson, for the rest of the game. After White has completely iced Black's light squared bishop out of the game and restricting Black's overall development, Paulson really felt the pressure here. And now he should have lashed out earlier with d5, right, and made it as complicated as possible. So in sort of just a stage of desperation, he plays f5, right? Similar to what we saw Morphy play as Black, f5 against Thompson. But in this case, he's not going to be able to open up the f file, which is what Thompson, not Thompson, but Paulson is hoping to accomplish here, right? In a dream scenario, open up your rook and connect with the bishop and adding pressure against White's f2 pawn. But now we feel that dark squared clamp really tighten after e5. The rook is blocked. The bishop is now anchored by this rock solid pawn on e5. This is an absolute nightmare for Paulson, and this ends up haunting him for the rest of the game. And we're not going to look at every single move, but we've already described what happened in the opening struggle. Paulson played in a casual manner. He relaxed while Morphy played as energetically as possible. And now Black's position is just looking terrible. We have an entombed bishop, all of these passive pieces that are just slumbering. And so let's fast forward, let's say about 14 moves, and see how the position has changed. Okay, a number of things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same as well. Notice that Black's king is looking a little shaky. Paulson lashed out with f5 earlier, which weakened the king side already. And now we're looking at this rook on f7, sort of trying to shelter the knight and maybe add some protection to the seventh rank, try to help the king. But notice this pawn on g6 is looking weak, and h5 is depending on the defense from this weak pawn. So positionally, this is already not looking very good. But as I mentioned, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things have stayed the same. Look at this light squared bishop and rook on a8. Because the bishop can't move, it's difficult for the rook to find any meaningful employment. The Sicilian is all about capturing, the pawn on d4 and opening up that c file, which can often be used, by say a rook or a queen. So these pieces are completely passive, merely observing events, unable to contribute in any meaningful way. And so this is still haunting Paulson well into the middle game. And with this in mind, the bishop that was on d6 or b6, we noticed has moved to d8. And one of the ideas is to try to break this dark squared bind by capturing Morphy's knight. And so Morphy, of course, takes back. And now, because the pawn is no longer defending the bishop, Paulson plays the move knight e8. And his idea is this pawn isn't going anywhere. So he's putting pressure against f6. And he's also attacking this bishop, which, remember, on move 8, planted itself on d6. And we're on move 25 here. And look at how that bishop is still being felt, in a very negative way by black. So this is such a wonderful moment in the game because Morphy is playing in a positional style to some extent that we don't always associate with Morphy because he has, all these wonderful attacking games. But basically, this positional clamp and Paulson's desperate ability or desperate attempts to try to create counterplay has resulted in this critical moment where Paul is more than happy to shift gears. No longer is he going to play as the positional anaconda, continuing to squeeze. Now it's time to light up some fireworks. So rather than continuing to try to find a way to defend his pawn or, do something that maybe doesn't ultimately make that much sense, Paul said, let's enjoy some complications. Let's dance. Bishop f4, he challenges the queen, and the queen really doesn't have a good move. The queen moves to h7, there's a fork. If the queen moves to f8, g6 falls, which we forecasted earlier as a weakness. And once g6 falls, that means h5 is falling. And so Paulson is forced to try to fight fire with fire. And unfortunately, Morphy was really good at dynamic play. And to make matters worse, Paulson is playing basically down two pieces, the bishop and the rook. They're just doing absolutely nothing. So after the move knight takes f6, Paul comes up with a really stunning idea. So black's queen is hanging, as is white's. Now, when you're looking at this game, but also, when you're playing your own game, oftentimes you'll come up with a good idea, like bishop f4, attacking the enemy queen, in this case. Well, how often do you threaten something, and then your opponent just ignores you and comes up with another threat, like knight f6? This can happen all the time, and it can be really frustrating. But one thing to remember is that when you are the first to initiate an attack and your opponent is counterattacking, now it's your move again, meaning you can sort of direct the course of action here. Yes, you could take the queen, continue with your idea, but then there's knight takes e4, and you have to look out for moves like knight takes f2, and it feels a little annoying. But hang on a second. If I move my queen anywhere, like let's just say e2, not a great square, black's queen is still hanging. So Morphy was able to recognize this tactical opportunity that attack, counterattack, well, I'm still attacking. It's my turn. I'm going to sacrifice my queen on c6. A desperado tactic. The queen is ready to fade into the sunset, but not without doing some more damage. So this was probably a pretty shocking move for Paulson. And notice by sacrificing the queen, you can't just take back and expect a good position, because after the bishop captures your queen, well, look at this. We have 3 minor pieces as white, and black now only has 2. So basically, Paulson is at risk of going down a piece. So Paulson tries to rise to the occasion and also plays a desperado queen move, capturing the bishop. And now we still have 2 queens completely hanging. But again, attack, counterattack. It's the attacker's turn. Well, attack, counterattack. Once again, the original attacker is on the move. So rather than capturing the queen and allowing black to capture white's queen, Morphy plays another desperado sacrifice. Queen takes c8, and this time it's with check. So black cannot continue any desperado dreams or continue to attack with the queen, and in fact is forced to capture the queen. And so now, after Morphy captures the queen, the smoke clears and Paul is up a piece, which is just a really cool tactic. I really encourage everyone to go through this sequence. It's quite instructive. And finally, Paulson's rook that was imprisoned on A8 enters the game. But even here, even in the end game, Morphy's not going to play passively, try to defend one of his pawns, which sometimes you have to do. No, in this case, he just said, okay, I'm up a piece. I'm going to play like I'm up a piece. These pieces are all, relatively active, doing things. I have a spectator on A1. Let's activate the rook. And so since Morphy is up a piece, there's no way Poulsen's going to trade rooks, right? Because then he's just down a piece. And this is a really active rook, right? So then as you are, behind in material, you don't want to simplify into a losing ending. You want to keep it as complicated as possible. So Poulsen does just that. He keeps it as complicated as possible by capturing the F2 pawn, threatens the knight, and Morphy could play a move, like knight e5 or something. But instead, he says, hey, do I have to react just yet? Yeah, my knight's hanging. I get that. Let me pay your king a visit. And this is just a nightmare scenario for black because, again, king h7 is going to fall into a fork here of the king and the rook. If the king moves to g7, white's rook has kind of sinister intentions down this g file, which is well supported by the move knight e5, attacking the rook and joining the white's rook and attacking this vulnerable g6 square. So moving the king is going to lead to disaster. Poulsen plays knight g8, self-pinning his knight, not a good sign. And after knight e5, Morphy's attacking the enemy rook while eyeing the g6 square, which will then pay a visit to the enemy king. And Poulsen's position is just completely hopeless, just collapsing. Maybe Poulsen, is forecasting the modern trend where you have these coaches tell their students never resign. So you'll often see games where players are down, a queen and two rooks or something, and pray for stalemate, and so they play on. And in this case, Poulsen tried to resist a bit longer, but Morphy ended up delivering mate, not that long after. So this is a really instructive game. I think the main thing, even the structure here at the very end, we can see that the C pawn and the E pawn moved. And of course, as Bobby Fischer mentioned, in order to get squares, you have to give squares. So this is a weakness that, sometimes happens in the Sicilian. And Morphy did an excellent job pouncing on this weakness. And when Poulsen blinked, he didn't rise to the occasion. This instructive idea of bishop d6 and anchoring that bishop with e5, I think is a really good positional lesson that we can take from this game, exploiting weakened squares due to pawn moves, and also recognizing that the game itself isn't always going to be won by positionally squeezing your opponent. At some point, complications are likely to occur, and you also have to be able to transition to playing, sharper, more aggressive chess to bring home the full point. So this was the first game against Poulsen, and we're going to finish our game analysis by looking at the grand finale game. I mean, one of my favorite Morphy games, in a game that I think can benefit everyone's chess by studying carefully and often.